It started with sunlight spilling across the lawns like liquid gold. Every house on Maple Crest Lane looked the same. Trimmed hedges, matching shutters, identical mailboxes lined in perfect rows. I used to think it was beautiful. That kind of beauty you see in magazines, where everything looks alive, but somehow isn't. My name is Evan Cole, and until last year, I believed in quiet. I believed in keeping my head down, paying my dues, and minding my own business. Then my garden changed everything. From my porch, you could see it stretch across the yard, a wild tangle of purple cone flowers, milkweed, and tall golden grasses swaying in the morning wind. It didn't fit the neighborhood's symmetry. It wasn't supposed to. My wife, Leah, loved wildflowers. Before cancer took her, she told me that neat lawns were just fear wearing green. I didn't really understand what she meant until after she was gone. Gardening was how I survived grief. Every seed I pushed into the soil felt like a heartbeat I was trying to remember. I wasn't planting chaos. I was planting memories. The neighbor smiled when I moved in 5 years ago. A widowed science teacher who spent weekends fixing fences and waving politely. But when the wildflowers started to bloom, those smiles turned tight. Curtains twitched. Whispers carried. I saw it in the way they mowed their lawns twice a week, glancing at my yard like it was a stain that wouldn't wash out that I didn't care. Not at first. Then one morning, a shadow fell across my porch. A clipboard. A white envelope with a red stamp. Homeowners Association violation notice. I remember laughing under my breath. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a friendly warning. The letter said my property did not comply with community landscaping standards. It gave him 10 days to correct the issue. 10 days to erase the only thing keeping me alive. That night I sat in the garden with a cup of tea, letting the wind move through the flowers. The air smelled of lavender and rain-soaked earth. Fireflies blinked like scattered stars. I told myself I could trim the edges, make it look tidier, whatever that meant. But deep down I knew that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted the wildness gone. By the 5th day, I had cut what I could, straightened the pathway, added mulch. Still, another letter arrived. Same wording, same red stamp. The HOA president's name sat neatly at the bottom. Nancy Dale. If you've ever met someone who believes rules are more sacred than kindness, you've met a Nancy Dale. Mid-50s. Perfect hair. Pearl necklace even when walking her dog. Her house looked like a showroom. Roses trimmed to identical heights. Grass short enough to measure with a ruler. She showed up the next morning, heels clicking against my driveway. "Evan," she said, tilting her head in that pitying way people do when they're about to ruin your day. "We've received complaints. The board believes your lawn detracts from the community's aesthetic." I stared at her clipboard. Aesthetic. I repeated, as if the word itself explained everything wrong here. She smiled politely. "This isn't personal. We all have to follow the same standards." "Standards," I said. "Or control." Her lips pressed into a line. "Please take care of it before the board imposes fines." Then she turned and left, heels echoing like punctuation marks. The first fine was $50, then $100, then $250. Every envelope carried the same cold language. Failure to comply will result in further penalties. I come home from school to find those envelopes stacked in my mailbox like silent threats. BY September. The fines reached $5,000. That was when I realized this wasn't about grass. It was about power. I stopped sleeping well. The house felt smaller. Every knock at the door made my pulse jump. Students asked why I looked tired. I told them grading papers was heavy this time off here. The truth was heavier. That night, I walked through my garden with a flashlight, watching moths flutter above the petals. Sometimes I wondered if Leah would have told me to give in, but I could almost hear her voice saying, "You can't reason with people who worship rules." The next HOA meeting was held in the community hall, a white-walled box that smelled of coffee and disinfectant, folding chairs in neat rows, a projector screen flashing the words Property Compliance Review. When my name was called, I stood. A dozen faces turned toward me. Most looked familiar, the same neighbors who used to wave when I shoveled their sidewalks. Now they looked through me. Nancy adjusted her glasses. Mr. Cole's yard continues to violate Section 3A of the Community Landscaping Covenant. Despite multiple notices, the property remains in compliance. A man in the back raised his hand. My wife says her allergies get worse because of his weeds. They're not weeds, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. They're native wildflowers. Good for pollinators. Good for the environment. Someone snorted. Another person muttered, then moved to a farm. The laughter that followed was quiet but sharp. Nancy folded her hands. Evan, we appreciate your enthusiasm for nature, but this neighborhood has a specific aesthetic. Everyone agreed to it when purchasing property. I didn't agree to be bullied for planting flowers, I said. Her eyes narrowed. Then I suppose the fines will continue. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of letters spread before me. Each one felt heavier than the last. I wanted to tear them up, but instead, I picked one and began to read every word. That's when I noticed a clause near the bottom, subject to state and municipal codes. That phrase stuck. As a teacher, I spent half my life teaching students to question assumptions. Maybe it was time to practice what I preached. That I opened my laptop and began searching. HOA finds native garden law. Wildflower rights homeowner. State Environmental Protection HOA. Hours passed. Pages blurred. But then, there it was, a statute protecting certified pollinator habitats. It said any property designated as such was exempt from HOA landscaping restrictions. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. The garden wasn't a violation. It was protected by law. That I filed the paperwork the next morning. Sent the certification request to the Department of Natural Resources. Within 2 weeks, a letter arrived confirming my garden's new status. Certified pollinator habitat #4478. I made copies. Sent one to the HOA. Sent another to Nancy. Days later, she knocked on my door again, clipboard in hand. Smile colder than before. You think this changes anything? She asked. Yes, I said, holding up the certificate. It changes everything. She looked at it, eyes flicking over the official seal, then handed it back. We'll see. When she left, I noticed something different in her posture. Tight shoulders, clipped steps, like someone realizing control was slipping through their fingers. The story might have ended there. It could have been over, but power doesn't give up easily. One morning I woke to a sharp chemical smell. I ran outside and saw it, brown streaks across my lawn, wilted flowers, dying stems. Someone had sprayed weed killer. I checked the security footage. Midnight, a shadow moving along the fence line. The figure was tall, hair tied back, a flashlight glinting. I couldn't see a face, but I didn't have to. The walk, the posture. I'd seen it before. Nancy I sent the footage to the police. They said they'd look into it. I knew what that meant. That nothing did I did what teachers do best. I documented everything. Photos, dates, footage, every violation they threw at me. I countered with evidence. If they wanted a war, I was ready to teach them what a slow, methodical lesson felt like. That's where it truly began. The battle that would turn a quiet neighborhood into a courtroom drama. Sometimes, revenge doesn't start with rage. It starts with patience. If you've ever been pushed to your limit by people who mistake authority for virtue, you'll understand what comes next. And if you've ever had to fight for something small but sacred like peace, then hit that like button. Because this story is for you. Why coffee steamed on the porch railing while birds picked at the feeder. It felt like any other morning until I saw the envelope, white thick and stamped with the HOA logo. I tore it open thinking it was another newsletter about neighborhood barbecues or pet leash reminders, but my stomach sank when I read the first line. That IT said I owed a fine of $5,000. The reason written in bold: unapproved landscaping and unsightly vegetation. I stood there for a while staring at the words as the steam from my cup drifted into the air. $5,000 for flowers. that I read it again hoping I was mistaken. The letter listed a series of violations. Dandelions in the front yard. Unregistered plants near the fence line. Excessive height of vegetation exceeding community standards. The garden that had become my peace was now considered an offense that a small voice inside me said to let it go. Pay the fine. Fix it. But another part of me whispered something colder. No, not this time. Later that afternoon, I walked to the HOA office. The building sat near the clubhouse, a square of beige concrete, surrounded by trimmed hedges that looked cloned. Inside it smelled like air freshener and printer ink. A woman at the front desk smiled mechanically. Her name tag read Pamela, that I told her I received a fine. She asked for my address and tapped at her keyboard, with long-polished nails. She printed something and handed it to me like a prescription. The violation form. I looked at the signature line at the bottom. Filed by board member, Gregory Hale Gregory. My neighbor from across the street. The same man who'd once complained about kids riding bikes too loudly. The same man who trimmed his hedge with a ruler that I asked to speak to him. Pamela's smile didn't move. She said Gregory wasn't in today. HOA matters must be handled through formal appeal. That I walked out into the sunlight, feeling the heat on my neck. Across the street Gregory's house gleamed. His perfect lawn stretched like carpet. His flag waved perfectly centered. He stood at his window looking out, as if he already knew I'd come from the office. Our eyes met for a second. Then he smiled. A slow, confident smile that told me this wasn't about flowers. That evening I called the number on the letter. A robotic voice gave me a list of options. Press 1 for payment. Press 2 for appeal. I pressed 2. The line connected to a voicemail box. I left a calm message explaining that my garden wasn't ugly and that it followed every guideline. I even quoted the HOA landscaping rules I'd read months before N01 called back. The next week another letter arrived. This time it said additional penalties would accrue daily if I didn't comply. The total was now $5,500. Neighbors began to notice. Some stopped by pretending to chat, but their eyes kept drifting to the garden. One evening Sarah, from next door, came over holding a casserole dish. She spoke softly like someone delivering bad news. They're saying your garden lowers property values. I laughed, but it didn't sound like me. Since when do butterflies lower property values? She didn't answer. She just said she was sorry and went back to her manicured porch. That night I sat outside under the dim porch light listening to the crickets. My flowers swayed gently. Their colors deepened in the dark. I thought about how much time I'd spent nurturing them, how they'd survived wind, frost, and drought, and now I was supposed to destroy them because they didn't match Gregory's idea of beauty. That I started reading the HOA bylaws. Every line, every clause. There were pages about fencing colors, lawn maintenance, parking rules, even trash can placement. But the landscaping section was vague. It used phrases like must maintain neighborhood harmony and consistent aesthetic standards. Ambiguous words that gave too much power to whoever interpreted them. That I highlighted every phrase that could defend me. Then I noticed something. The document required that any fine exceeding $1,000 must be approved by a board vote. I found no record of any meeting in the HOA's online minutes. That night I couldn't sleep. The sprinkler clicked on at Gregory's house right at midnight like I'd always did. I watched the rhythmic spray catch the moonlight. My own garden glowed faintly silver and wild. That's when I realized the fight wasn't about money. It was about control. The next morning I printed my appeal. 3 copies. I slid one under the HOA office door. 1 in Gregory's mailbox. And I kept one taped to my refrigerator. 3 days later a notice appeared on my door. The HOA had scheduled a special compliance inspection that IT would be conducted by Gregory Hale himself. That I stood in my kitchen, holding that notice for a long time. Then I poured another cup of coffee and whispered to myself that this was just the beginning. Because if they wanted a war over flowers, I was going to give them one. That the morning of the inspection came with heavy clouds that hung low over the cul-de-sac. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. I stood on my porch watching the street. Everything was quiet except for the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere beyond the trees. Migerton swayed gently in the wind like it knew what was coming. At exactly 9 o'clock, a white SUV pulled up in front of my driveway. The HOA seal was printed neatly on the door. Gregory stepped out wearing khaki pants, a polo shirt, and a clipboard tucked under his arm. His expression was calm and practiced, like a man who had been waiting for this moment. 2 other board members followed. I recognized one of them, a man named Jeff who rarely smiled. The third was a woman I didn't know, but she held a camera. I walked down the steps slowly. "Morning," I said. Gregory didn't look at me right away. He scanned the yard, the walkway, the small patches offered between the stones. "We're here for your inspection," he said finally, "as you were notified." I nodded. "You're welcome to take a look, but I already filed an appeal." He ignored that. The woman with the camera began taking pictures. Every angle, every flower. She even photographed the wooden border I'd built to keep the soil from washing away. Gregory crouched near a patch of lavender. "This exceeds height limitations," he murmured, writing something on his clipboard. "It's 12 inches, I said quietly. "The limit is 18. He looked up at me with a faint smile. "Not when the soil grade changes. You see, your property sits slightly elevated, so by visual measure it appears higher, which makes it incompliant." It was such a technical twist that I almost laughed. But I didn't. I just stood there as they moved methodically across my yard, documenting everything like detectives at a crime scene. When they were done, Gregory turned toward me. "You'll receive an updated fine within 10 business days," he said, "and your appeal has been denied." I felt my chest tighten. "Denied? You didn't even review it." He smiled politely. "The board reviewed it this morning. Unanimous decision." I knew then he'd already made sure of that. The SUV drove off. The first drops of rain began to fall. They tapped against the petals off me flowers and darkened the soil beneath them. I stayed there in the drizzle, watching the water bead along the leaves. For the first time in weeks, the garden didn't look peaceful. It looked fragile. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop open. I began searching for stories of HOA abuse. There were hundreds. People fined for flags, mailboxes, kids' toys left on porches. Whole communities divided by power-hungry boards. Some fought back and won. Others lost everything that I read until the screen blurred. That's when I came across a local news article about my own HOA. A few years back, they'd been audited for misuse of funds. The treasurer at the time was forced to resign, but the board remained intact. Gregory's name was listed among the signatories, who approved the questionable expenses. Landscaping contracts. Maintenance fees. It didn't take much imagination to guess where some of that money had gone. I felt a quiet shift inside me. Something sharper than anger. It wasn't enough to fight the fine anymore. I wanted the truth. Over the next few days, I started gathering everything. Copies of letters, screenshots off bylaws, timestamps from the HOA meeting logs. I printed them all and marked the irregularities, the lack of votes, the missing meeting notes, the unapproved budget line for external beautification. It was small but suspiciously recurring. Then I noticed a pattern. Every year around the same month, homeowners who had disagreements with Gregory received fines. Different reasons each time: fence color, mailbox height, grass length. And those fines were always issued just before the HOA requested additional funds for maintenance. IT hit me. The fines weren't just control. They were leveraged. A week later, I received another envelope. Inside was the updated fine, $6,250. At the bottom of the page was a note. Failure to pay may result in a lien against your property. I folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. The room felt smaller. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. That night I couldn't sleep again. I walked out to the garden barefoot. The soil was damp and cool beneath my feet. The moon hung low, pale, and distant. I ran my fingers through the petals, whispering an apology to the flowers that might not survive the week. Then something clicked and I realized that if Gregory could weaponize the rules, I could too. The bylaws didn't just define restrictions, they defined responsibilities. The board was legally bound to maintain transparency. Every fine issued, every expenditure, every vote had to be recorded and made available upon request. And failure to comply could void penalties and expose them to liability. The next morning I sent an email to the HOA requesting full access to all meeting minutes, financial statements, and correspondence related to landscaping enforcement. I CC'd the county clerk's office. Within 2 hours Gregory called me. His voice was calm but tight. "You can't request those records directly through the county. That's not the procedure." I said quietly, "Actually, under Section 4.7 of the HOA Transparency Act, I can." There was a long silence. Then he said, "You're making a mistake." "No," I said. "I'm fixing one." He hung up. That same afternoon I received an email, not from him, but from Pamela, the receptionist. She said the documents would be ready for review by Friday. When Friday came, I walked into the HOA office again. Pamela wasn't smiling this time. She handed me a folder that felt heavier than paper should. Inside were hundreds of pages, budgets, emails, votes. I took them home, spread them across my dining table, and started dreading. By midnight I found what I was looking for. A series of payments labeled Landscape Enforcement Consulting. Every payment went to a company registered under a name I recognized, Hale Property Services. Gregory's company. He wasn't just enforcing the fines. He was profiting from them. I sat back and let the realization sink in. Outside, thunder rolled over the neighborhood. My reflection stared back from the window, tired eyes but steady. I knew what had to come next if he wanted to play by the rules. I was going to show him what the real rules looked like. The rain had washed the dirt clean, but not the idea. I sat at my dining table under a single lamp that threw a circle of light over the papers. Outside the windows, the neighborhood slept in uniform rows of trimmed hedges and silent porches. The moon pulled a pale ribbon across Gregory Hale's perfect roof. In that light, I felt less like a man fighting an HOA fine and more like someone who had found the thread that would unravel a sweater of lies. I started small and steady. Teachers are good at lesson plans and experiments. I treated this like research. If you want to beat HOA abuse, you have to outwork the bureaucracy. You have to follow the paperwork until it leads you to something you can prove. If you want Toby to $5,000 HOA fine, you don't scream at meetings. You gather evidence and you build allies. First I made a list. Homeowner rights, HOA fine procedures, official channels, environmental law protecting native plants, and pollinator garden certifications. I wrote the keywords down on sticky notes: HOA abuse, ugly garden, pollinator garden, homeowner rights, native plants. Environmental law. Each time I stuck one on the fridge, it reminded me I wasn't fighting anesthetic preference. I was fighting a system that disguised profiteering as standards. I called my friend Lena, who ran the local community legal clinic. She answered on the second ring. Her voice felt like a lifeline in the dark. She read the HOA bylaws I'd scanned in, then she said something direct and useful. They had violated procedural rules. The fines were not only harsh, they were administered without proper voting records. That made the fines invalid or at least vulnerable. The first victory was not dramatic. It was procedural. The board had to follow its own rules. Next, I reached out to the county records office. There are few things as satisfying to a stubborn teacher as public records. I submitted formal records requests for the HOA meeting minutes for the last 5 years. I requested copies of contracts tied to landscaping and any correspondence involving Hale Property Services. I phrased the request in plain language: homeowner rights. The clerk emailed back a timeline and an approximate cost. It was slow bureaucratic work, and it felt great. While I waited, I crafted the public story. If this was going to be a neighborhood feud, I would show how petty it began and how crooked it had become. I called a young reporter I'd met once at the school fair. Her name was Maya. She liked bites of stories that smelled like injustice, When I explained HOA abuse and the $5,000 threat, she asked for documents. I sent her scanned copies of notices and the photographic evidence for my security cameras. I sent her the trail of payments I'd found linking Hale Property Services to the HOA's landscape enforcement line. I wrote an email with the phrase ugly garden and native plants so it would sit naturally in her notes. Maya's story ran quietly at first on a local news site. She wrote about pollinator garden certification and homeowner rights. She quoted environmental law that protected native gardens and explained how an HOA fine could escalate into a lien and a foreclosure. The article used the phrase HOA fine and ugly garden in the same paragraph, so people understood how absurd the scale of this fight was. The comments came fast and messy. Some sided with Gregory and his neat lawn. Others, more than I'd expected, sided with Thebes. That was the turning point. Once a local reporter framed it as a payoff pattern, not just a single dispute, the neighborhood began to shift. People who had been silent in meetings started to come forward. A woman named Rosa from 2 blocks over said she had received a notice for a mailbox height violation the same week she disagreed with Gregory about apropos lighting plan. A young couple said a fence paint dispute had somehow turned into a landscaping summons last year. The more stories I collected, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA used ambiguous rules to levy fines and then steered contracts toward Hale Property Services. This is where payback stories get interesting. You don't need cinematic fireworks. You need pressure in the right spots. Bureaucracy is a machine that creaks when you feed it unexpected friction. I began to file formal complaints with state agencies. I filed a complaint with the department that oversaw nonprofit associations about lack of transparency. I filed a separate complaint with the county alleging a conflict of interest and possible self-dealing. I mailed certified letters demanding meeting minutes and financial statements. I listed the dates and the dollar amounts, and I kept copies. Meanwhile, I prepared the garden for the stage it would inevitably become. If the narrative hinged on an ugly garden, then I would show it as the opposite. I put up a simple sign at the yard's edge: Pollinator Garden Certified, and included the certification number. The sign was small and factual, but in a neighborhood of homogeneity, it read like a declaration. Camera crews love symbols. The sign gave the cameras an image to hold onto that at home. I started receiving strange notes slid under the door. Vague threats about community standards. A crumpled printout of my own identification left on the doormat late one night that made the hair on my neck stand up. Someone had been snooping. I installed more cameras. I learned the pattern of their footsteps in the dark. I learned the faces I could not fully see, but could almost recognize by the set of their shoulders and the cadence of their walk. That I wasn't reckless. I asked Lena to draft a letter to the HOA laying out the procedural violations and requesting an immediate suspension of fines until an independent audit could be conducted. She included terms homeowner rights and HOA fine in careful legal language. The letter landed like a gauntlet. It was formal and hard to dismiss. I mailed it and then posted a copy to the community bulletin board where everyone saw it. Then I called a meeting. Not an HOA meeting, but a community meeting. I invited neighbors who had experienced arbitrary enforcement, and those who loved the flowers, and those who barely cared but wanted the truth. We met in the park under a stand of elms, where the light broke through leaves like tiny stage lights. People showed up with stories and receipts and tired faces. Some carried photos of their own yards with letters stapled to them. Others carried nothing at all and listened. It was humbling and fierce at once. That meeting we voted to demand transparency. We drafted a petition requesting that the HOA board disclose all contracts and certify that none of the members profited from enforcement. We handed the petition to Maya, who promised to bring it to her editor. We sent the petition to the county clerk too, with the words homeowner rights in the subject line. The pressure tightened. The board responded with a denser legal tone and threats to sue for defamation. That's when I knew I had reached a point of no return. They were scared or were cornered, and either way they were going to lash out. It was time to prepare for litigation. That I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in association law. Her name was Sarah Nguyen, young, sharp, efficient. She smelled faintly of coffee and determination. She read through my folder, the invoices, the minutes that were missing, and the payments to HOA Property Services. She said something straightforward that felt like relief. We have a conflict of interest and a failure of procedure that makes the fines unenforceable and opens the board up to sanctions. She took my case on a contingency basis, which meant she believed we could win. But legal strategy is slow. It gives you leverage, but not headlines. So we worked both fronts. Sarah drafted subpoenas to obtain the HOA bank records and contracts. Maya prepared a follow-up piece that showed the payments to HOA Property Services and quoted the county clerk, who confirmed our records request was pending. The story hit the online page at noon, and within an hour neighbors were calling my phone. People I barely knew wanted to sign witness statements. Their willingness to speak up was the lifeblood of the plan. Now for the harder part. Evidence of wrongdoing is paper and testimony. Evidence of intent is behavior. If Gregory had been spraying my garden with weed killer or orchestrating intimidation, then we needed to catch it live. Cameras had shown a shadow before, but not a clear face. My plan was simple and risky. I baited the trap with a camera visible from the street and another hidden in plain sight. I left a small watering can at the edge of the garden for aesthetics, and because details matter in footage. I kept live feeds to my phone and instructed 2 neighbors to be on call for any suspicious movement at night. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then on the 4th night, a figure moved along the sidewalk under the halo of a street lamp. The posture was familiar. She paused at the corner, then crossed directly to the garden. The visible camera turned and caught her profile clearly as she crouched and began to spray something from a small bottle. The hidden camera recorded the action from a lower angle and caught her face as she leaned over the flowers. It was Gregory's assistant Pam with an HOA badge pinned to her jacket and a HOA Property Services cap sitting in the passenger seat of a car idling across the street. The evidence was cleaner than I dared hope. The video files were time-stamped. The audio picked up a faint muttered complaint about the mess, and the resolution of the footage let us read a word on a clipboard the assistant held. We called Sarah, and she said, "Hold everything. Do not confront them." We had what we needed. The next morning the neighborhood felt crackled. I posted the footage with a short caption that used the phrase HOA abuse and ugly garden in a way that felt factual, not sensational. Maya ran it. The clip spread. People watched the assistant spray, and then saw the driver return to a truck with HOA Property Services stenciled on the side. Comments poured in, some expressed shock, others relief. A few angry posts defended the HOA, but more people contacted us offering statements and more documentation. When the board convened to respond, they did so in a meeting that felt like a defensive scrum. Public pressure had shifted power. The county clerk's office sent a representative to observe. The local reporter asked tough questions. The board scrambled to justify its actions with the same ambiguous clauses that had protected them before. Sarah walked into that room with subpoenas in her hand, and the recorded footage cued to play. The sound of the video in the meeting room was a kind of justice. The assistant's movements were slow and obvious. The truck with the HOA Property Services logo idled and film outside. The board squirmed. Nancy Dale's voice was smaller than usual. Gregory's face remained defiant, but there was a brutal quality to it now. They tried to call it a misunderstanding and threatened to pursue defamation claims. Sarah responded with a calm list of statutory violations and a demand for an independent audit. The setup had worked because it was patient and procedural. We had turned HOA abuse into a public record and then into a legal problem for the board. Payback was not about making them hurt. It was about making them accountable. It was about showing the neighborhood that homeowner rights are not suggestions. They are law. That night neighbors left bouquets and small potted native plants near my mailbox. The bees landed on them as if to bless the small rebellion. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and thought about how fragile and how stubborn justice can be. If you found this part of the story familiar, hit like and subscribe so more people see how small acts can change a community. The morning of the hearing came with clear skies and the sharp brightness that follows a week of rain. The world looked freshly washed. Even the asphalt of the HOA parking lot glistened like polished stone. I parked my old sedan between two spotless SUVs and turned off the engine. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked calm, but my heartbeat was a steady drum. This was it. The culmination of months of quiet anger, sleepless nights, and meticulous planning. The HOA had called a special board session to address ongoing defamation and compliance matters. I knew what that meant. Gregory Hale and his board wanted to regain control of the narrative. But I had brought more than just my words. I had truth documents and witnesses. The meeting room was the same as always. Cream walls, a fake plant in the corner, and rows of plastic chairs facing a long table. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. People filled the room long before the meeting began. Neighbors who had once looked away now filled the seats, their faces expectant, tense. Some nodded at me as I walked in. Rosa sat near the front, clutching her folder of letters. The young couple with the paint dispute whispered quietly to each other. Gregory sat at the center of the board table, wearing a blue blazer and the expression of a man who still believed authority was armor. Beside him were the remaining board members, tight-lipped and pale. Pamela, the assistant caught on video, sat 2 seats down, her eyes on the floor. When the clock struck 10, Gregory tapped his gavel lightly. "We'll begin," he said. His voice was calm, measured, rehearsed. "This meeting concerns allegations made against the Homeowners Association and its members. Before we proceed, I remind everyone that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated." He looked directly at me as he said it. Sarah sat beside me, a stack of folders on her lap. Her expression was still and unreadable, like stone under water. When Gregory invited us to speak, she rose first. Her tone was polite, almost soft, but every word carried weight. "Mr. Hale, we're not here to argue feelings. We're here to discuss evidence." She opened a folder and laid out documents in a clean line across the table. "Here are records of payments from HOA funds to Hale Property Services for landscape enforcement. Here are the dates those payments were approved, often within days of fines being issued to homeowners. And here," she slid the last page forward, "is video evidence of a Hale employee trespassing and damaging a homeowner's garden while wearing HOA identification." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Gregory's jaw tightened. "This is a smear campaign," he said sharply. "Those payments were legitimate. Our board approved them." Sarah nodded. "Show us the votes." He blinked. "What?" She repeated, slower. "Show us the board votes that approve those expenditures. According to your own bylaws, any spending over $1,000 requires a recorded vote and majority approval. There are no records in the minutes." Gregory's mouth opened, but no words came. From the back, Maya, the reporter, lifted her camera. The soft click of the shutter filled the silence. She had come not as a friend, but as a witness that I stood then, not to speak over Sarah, but to speak to the room. My voice was quieter than I expected, but steady. "This isn't about flowers," I said. "It's about power. About a system meant to serve neighbors being turned into a weapon against them. My garden is not ugly that it's alive. It feeds bees and butterflies. It restores soil. What's ugly is the way we let greed hide behind rules." There was a small sound, a chair creaking, someone shifting forward. Gregory banged his gavel again. "You're out of order." Sarah turned to him. "No, Mr. Hale. You are." She reached into her briefcase and produced an envelope. "This is a formal notice of a pending investigation by the state's Department of Consumer Protection into your association's financial practices. As of this morning, your accounts are frozen pending review." The room went silent. Even the buzzing lights seemed to dim. Gregory's face drained of color. "You can't." But she cut him off. "We can and we have." Pamela stood suddenly, her chair scraping back. "I didn't know he was using my paycheck for that," she blurted. "He told me we were checking for invasive weeds." Her voice shook. He said if I didn't help, I'd lose my job. The words landed like hammers. Every face in the room turned toward Gregory. He stood now too, red-faced, his composure unraveling. You don't understand, Hess snapped. This community, these people, they need order. Without it, everything falls apart. I looked at him and felt something unexpected. Pity. Not forgiveness, but pity. Order isn't control, I said quietly. It's trust. And you lost it. The state representative seated near the back, a thin man in a gray suit, finally spoke. Mr. Hale, under the terms of your association charter, misuse of funds and unrecorded expenditures constitute grounds for immediate suspension pending investigation. Gregory's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked much smaller than the man who once smiled through my window. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors surrounded me. Some clapped my shoulder, others simply nodded. Maya approached with her recorder. Anything you want to say on record? She asked by thought for a long second, then said, I just want people to remember that fairness doesn't grow out of fear. It grows from the same thing a garden does, care and patience. That line made it into her next story. Within days, the county announced an audit of the HOA's finances. The board member resigned one by one, each statement shorter than the last. The HOA bank account showed thousands in questionable payments to Hale Property Services. The fine against my garden was nullified, the lien threat withdrawn, and every homeowner fined under similar circumstances was reimbursed. Gregory tried to fight it. He filed counterclaims. But public opinion had shifted too far. When the audit results became public, his company's contracts were terminated, and within a month, he sold his house. That I watched the moving truck one morning from my porch. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. He didn't look at me as he closed the door behind him. I didn't wave. There was nothing left to say. But peace doesn't arrive with silence alone. It comes slowly, like the first green shoots after frost. The next weekend, the neighborhood gathered again. Not for a meeting, but for something different. Rosa suggested a community garden. Not a private one. Not for fines or approvals, but shared space. Children painted wooden signs, and people brought seeds from their yards. The soil was dark and soft beneath our fingers. Bees drifted lazily from flower to flower. Standing there among my neighbors, I realized the true meaning of payback. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what mattered. Later that evening, as the sun sank low and the light turned amber, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The sound of laughter from the park carried across the street. My garden glowed gold in the dying light. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it grows quietly in the dirt. If you ever face something like this, if you ever get fined for trying to make something beautiful, remember this story. Remember that rules are only as strong as the people who question them. And if you believe every ugly garden has its own kind of beauty, like this video, share it, and let others know that even small acts of fairness can bloom into change, because sometimes peace is the loudest revenge of all. The weeks after the hearing passed, like the slow drift of late summer clouds. The air grew softer, the evenings stretched longer, and for the first time in months I felt the quiet weight of peace return to my yard. There were no envelopes on the porch, no letters taped to my door. Only the rustle of wind through lavender and the low hum of bees over marigolds. The IT was strange how quickly the world began to heal once the noise stopped. The same neighbors who used to hurry past my gate now lingered at the fence, asking about soil mixes and seed types. Rosa came by every morning with her straw hat and her soft laughter. Together we cleared the patch behind the old park sign, turning it into neat rows of soil ready for planting. The HOA board was temporarily disbanded. The county assigned an interim manager, a quiet woman named Elaine who spoke softly and carried a clipboard filled with more kindness than authority. She stopped by one afternoon to ask if she could walk the property. She took pictures of the garden, not for evidence but admiration. This is what the new policy should look like, she said. Native plants, low water use, pollinator-friendly design. You were ahead of the curve. Her words landed gently, like sunlight through trees. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was defending something. I was simply living in it. The local paper ran another story a month later. The garden that changed an HOA. It wasn't sensational. It didn't mention the shouting or the fines. It spoke instead of neighbors learning to listen to one another again. Maya had written it with care, her words wrapping the truth in calm dignity that I read it once, then folded it neatly and kept it in a drawer. Some stories belong not to the world, but to the quiet memory of having survived them. One evening, just as the sun slipped behind the roofs, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The garden glowed in gold and amber tones. The old oak near the fence line swayed slowly, its leaves whispering in the breeze. I could still see faint marks on the soil where the camera had once been found, but the sight no longer made my chest tighten. It was just earth now, clean, breathing, alive. Down the street, children laughed as they chased fireflies. Their voices echoed softly across the cul-de-sac. Somewhere a sprinkler hissed. The sound folded into the rhythm of crickets and wind. It felt like a symphony for peace. Gregory Hale had moved out 2 months earlier. The house stood empty for a while, its windows dark, its perfect hedges slowly overgrowing. Eventually, a new family moved in, a young couple with a baby and a rescue dog that barked at butterflies. The wife planted sunflowers along the fence line. The husband waved every morning on his way to work. It waved back. No bitterness remained. Sometimes at dusk I imagined Gregory, sitting wherever he was now, perhaps wondering how things might have been different if he had chosen cooperation over control. I didn't hate him. I didn't even pity him anymore. He had built his kingdom on rules, and when those rules cracked, he was left standing in the ruins. That was his garden to tend as autumn crept closer. The colors deepened. Gold turned to rust, lavender to gray. Yet everything still felt alive, even in its fading. That's what people misunderstand about gardens. They're not static. They're cycles. They bloom, die, return, and begin again. One night, as I watered the last few herbs before frost, Rosa looked up from her corner of the patch and said, "You know, for something they called ugly, this garden brought more people together than any HOA meeting ever did." I smiled. Maybe ugly things are just misunderstood things. We laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy alone, but from survival. Later, as darkness folded over the neighborhood, I went inside and opened the box where it kept every HOA notice. One by one, I burned them in the fireplace. The papers curled, edges glowing orange, then fell into white ash. The smoke smelled faintly of ink and endings. When it was done, I stepped outside again. The night was cool and still. My garden shimmered under the moonlight. Each leaf held a silver edge. Each petal reflected a quiet glow that I whispered into the dark. We made it. And in that moment, it felt as if the garden answered, not in words, but in the soft rustle of leaves, the hum of crickets, and the distant sound of neighbors laughing somewhere down the street. Months passed. The HOA reformed under new leadership. Elaine stayed on as manager. The new bylaws were shorter, clearer, and kinder. There was even a new clause, the Hale Amendment, some called it, ensuring no fines could be issued without a full board vote and documented evidence. It was a small line of text, but it carried the weight of every battle fought for fairness. By spring, the community garden had tripled in size. Children from the nearby school visited to learn about soil health. Elderly neighbors brought their old seeds from forgotten drawers. Bees hovered thick over blossoms. Every Saturday we gathered to plant, talk, and share tea. There were no forms to fill, no threats of violation, only hands in the earth. One afternoon, a boy of about 10 pointed to my original patch near the porch. "Did you really get fined for that?" he asked. I nodded. $5,000. He blinked, surprised. "For flowers? For believing that beauty doesn't need permission?" I said. He grinned, and for some reason that grin felt like the real victory. Years later, people would still tell the story of the garden that changed the neighborhood. They'd mention the scandal, the fines, the downfall. But to me, the story had never been about punishment. It had been about growth, about standing your ground until the earth itself agrees you belonged. Out on the anniversary of a hearing, I placed a small wooden sign at the edge of the garden. It read simply, "Let it grow." No date, no name. Just a reminder. That evening, as the last light fell and the world turned gold one final time, I sat on the porch and watched the shadows stretch long across the soil. The air smelled of earth and peace. That I closed my eyes and let it all wash over me. The memory, the struggle, the victory that wasn't loud but lasting. And I thought, maybe this is what justice really looks like. Not a fight won, but a garden that keeps growing long after the storm has passed, because in the end, the garden was never ugly. It was simply honest, and honesty, when it finally blooms, is the most beautiful thing of all.